I was watching Storm. The shelduck went and it was flying, and Storm was quite way out as well. And she came steaming across the sky and then put in that stoop. And I was just watching this never-ending stoop. I mean, she was just coming and coming and coming. By then, I had no idea where the duck was, how high the duck was, and next minute, Storm hit this shelduck. She struck the thing, and the shelduck literally just came tumbling out of the sky.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of the Falconry Told podcast, and what is now our fourth installment of the Cape Falconry Club series. And I really hope you've been enjoying the series so far and been kind of enjoying getting a new perspective of falconry from a different part of the world. Very special thanks again to the Cape Falconry Club for the invite and for having us help bring their falconry to the rest of the world. It's a trip I'll never forget, and like I said, I hope you all have been enjoying it so far. Also, a special thank you to the Falconry Heritage Trust for helping to spring for the grant for the travel expenses to make it there to help get this series recorded. And if you want to help support their cause, which is to help preserve the falconry culture from around the world and our falconry heritage, just head to falconryheritage.org and you can find out more information about their organization and donate, contribute, whatever you'd like to do. It would be greatly appreciated. And I also want to give a quick shout out and brag some more about Bobby Yaga Crafts from Poland, who is one of our newest sponsors. And as you know, you have heard me brag about his products for a while now on the podcast. Great stuff. I just got some more of his anklets and can't wait to use them for the upcoming season. As I've stated before, the anklets that he makes with the Marshall Easy Twist nuts sewn into them is my personal favorite. He makes everything handcrafted. The stitching and the leather and everything is of the highest quality. So if you haven't checked out his products yet, I highly recommend you do so. All of our information for how to get a hold of him can be found on our website at falconrytold.com, or you can just look him up on Instagram. It's at Bobby Yaga Goshawk on Instagram. So definitely check it out if you haven't. It's well worth your time. Okay, and in this episode of the Cape Falconry Club series, we bring you all Trevor Oertel, and I know that I'm not pronouncing that right, Trevor. You'll have to forgive me. There's only so much you can do with the Southern Indiana twang to a degree and not being able to roll your R's. So anyway, do my best. So like I said, apologies, but hey, man, it was a good effort. But anyway, so Trevor's one of the guys that was instrumental in getting falconry legalized and maintained in the Western Cape area. He also brings, like a lot of these guys, just a wealth of knowledge and experiences. I really think that you'll enjoy this conversation, hopefully like you have the rest of them so far in the series too. But Trevor's definitely got a lot of interesting experiences and stories to share about that process. And yeah, man, I can't do it justice by talking about it. So as always, we're just going to go ahead and jump right in to this conversation with Trevor, and I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. Yeah, I'm glad that at least as tiring as it is, as crappy as it is outside, I'm glad that I've had a lot to do today to kind of fill, what otherwise is just a wash of a day.
Oh, absolutely, John. I mean, what would we have done with ourselves if it wasn't for the rain? So, yeah, it's probably a blessing in disguise.
Well, probably, what we're doing right now, which is, kind of, drinking. But
absolutely. I think we might have been drinking a bit more, though.
Yeah, probably. Which, cheers, by the way. We'll go ahead and
to your health.
Yep.
Welcome to Africa.
Well, thank you. So you've lived here your whole life?
I've lived here not my whole life, but essentially the bulk of my life. As a youngster, I moved to my father was actually involved with General Motors. He was fairly senior in General Motors, and he had to open up a branch in Luxembourg. And that's literally how my falconry career started as a young kid. Moved to Luxembourg. I was all of 5 years old. I just started school in South Africa. Moved to Luxembourg, and it was a case of, we either go to what they call the American school or we go to the local Luxembourgish school. And of course, in Luxembourg, it's German or French. Those are the two languages. And we literally arrived as kids. And I remember one of my teachers, she gave me a picture dictionary book. And while scrolling through it, there was a photograph of a gentleman busy feeding a peregrine falcon. And that was me down the tubes. That was 30-something years ago. No, yeah, 30-something years ago. Can you believe it?
Yeah. And how young did you say you were again around that time?
I was 5.
5?
Yeah. As I say, I just started school. In fact, as a youngster, the funny thing was that I was, I'm sure many of us ask ourselves, how did I become interested in falconry? Why did I become interested in falconry? I always claim I probably just got dropped in my head when I was born. But yes, it was a case of I had a passion for birds as a young kid. We had a lot of friends that were farmers, a lot of family also that were farmers. And all of these guys, all of them seemed to keep crows as pets. It was the norm with a lot of our, as I say, family and family friends. And I looked at the crows and I thought, these things are really nice, but I would really like a falcon or a hawk. Not for a minute even knowing or thinking about falconry. It was literally just a case of having a pet hawk that I could let fly and call it back. The hunting side of things just never, didn't feature with me. And as I say, as a 5-year-old kid, paging through a little German picture dictionary with a of all things, a falconer. And that was how I started.
Well, and you said that a lot of people kept crows as pets. I mean, did you guys have them as well, or was that something that...
No, not at all. No, it was something that I looked at getting. Obviously, before I saw that realized that there was something such as falconry. So no, I didn't have a crow. The funny thing at the moment is that I'm actually involved with what you Americans call abatement. I prefer to call pest control. Mm-hmm. Myself and my son, we do pest control work in Dubai, in the UAE, and one of our main target pest birds are crows. So I have a soft spot for crows. I mean, they're super bright, etc. They're good fun to hunt. But yeah, I'm actually chasing them around the sandpit, having great fun. That's what I do if I'm not in South Africa.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you commute back and forth then? I mean, how often are you back and forth?
Well, the idea initially was to sort of commute every few months. And then, of course, COVID caught us. And I literally got stuck in Dubai for a few years. I think, if I remember offhand, our COVID lockdown was roughly 2 years. So the idea now is to commute backwards and forwards. I also have an import-export business, and that was... literally what I was doing in Dubai was to help my son set him up in his business, get James on his feet, and then start an import-export business, which I have at the moment. It's called SAB Concepts. The SAB stands for South Africa Plan B. One always has to look ahead just in case. So yeah, that's what I do at the moment. Obviously, as I say, now that COVID is a thing of the past, it will be backwards and forwards. Ideally, what I'm aiming at, I'm now at that age where I'm sort of looking at retiring. I probably started looking at retiring when I was about 18, but be that as it may. I'm kind of looking at 6 months in Dubai and 6 months in South Africa, literally coming through for our winter months and just doing 6 months of solid hawking. That's in an ideal world.
Yeah, well, I mean, in my ideal world, I wouldn't work either. I don't know many of us that would. Although, I mean, there are some people that are just straight, workaholics that just live to work. I definitely don't consider myself in that category. But I mean, I guess if you've been able to do things that you enjoy, which I mean, it sounds like for the most part you have kind of enjoyed.
Oh, very much so.
So I mean, it can't be that bad for you.
No, very much so. No, I've enjoyed every minute of my life. Trust me, I came into this world screaming and shouting, and I'm going to leave screaming and shouting as well. I'm not going to go out easily, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, and so as far as those like kind of intermediary years between, school and everything else. I mean, what were you doing kind of early on, with falconry? I mean, how did you kind of get introduced into it past, obviously you just talked about how you found out about it, but did you have anybody that kind of, helped you at an early age with it, or?
As a youngster, yes, in Luxembourg I did, and I can just unfortunately only remember the gentleman's first name, and that was Herr Thomas. He was an uncle of a friend of mine from school, and he started showing me the ropes. We played around with a kestrel for a while. I mean, I must have been 7 or 8 at that stage, and it was literally a case of, you find a nest. We'll have a look at what you found, and if it's good enough for falconry, we'll lift an ice, and life carries on. Now that was in the early 70s, 1970s, and as luck would have it, we did find a nest. We found a European goshawk nest, a Habisht, and I was very excited, and I spent a lot of time watching these birds, and I was sort of getting ready to pull an ice. The truth of it is, I suppose it probably wouldn't have been the best bird for a youngster, but anyway, and just before the birds were ready to take, came home, and my dad says, we have a choice. We go to the States or we go back to South Africa. Often I wonder what would have happened if we'd moved to the States. Who knows, maybe I'd be out hunting sage-grouse somewhere, big boomers. But yeah, we decided to head back home, got back to South Africa, literally got off the plane, arrived at Nature Conservation. I twisted my mom's arm to take me to the local Nature Conservation office, which was in Port Elizabeth. And as a youngster, I will never forget, I was probably a bit taller than most, but I remember looking up at this old gentleman, and he was quite a tall, lanky guy. And I said, I'd like to do falconry. How do I go about it? And the gentleman looked at me and he said, falconry. He says, in a very broad South African accent, what's that? The study of flowers. I remember thinking as a kid, I'm just trying to work out how old would I have been. I would have probably been 9, maybe going on 10. And I remember looking at this gentleman thinking, you idiot, that's botany. Anyway, I explained to him what falconry was. And as soon as I got on to hawks, eagles, owls, and falcons and the like, it was a case of, no, that's illegal. You may not do that. Anyway, long story short, my mom and I left both disheartened, and as we were driving, funny enough, still to the hotel, at that stage, my parents didn't even have a home. We were living in a hotel. We stayed in a hotel for many months. We drove back to the hotel, and my mom said, just don't tell your dad. My dad was a stickler for certain things, and abiding by the law was one of them. And she said, just don't tell your dad. And it was a secret that her and I kept for many, many years. I started falconry illegally. It was probably something that sort of formed who I am as a person. I've been very, very active in the South African falconry scene for many years from a legalization point of view. I was involved with the formation of SAFA, the Cape Falconers Club, and a few others. And my motivation was that I just don't want my son or any friends to have to go through illegal falconry, because it wasn't easy. As a youngster, I was flying African goshawks, jackal buzzards, etc. And these birds were, part of the manning process was literally to tuck the bird under your jacket in case I came across someone as I'm walking along with a hawk. I just couldn't afford it. So the bird would quickly be slipped into the jacket, and we'd hope for the best. I was very lucky, and this is where I became legal. In those days, we had to do national service conscription. We had 2 years of conscription in South Africa. And I was fortunate, due to my dad's work, he supplied a lot of earth-moving equipment to the South African Army. And their chief buyer came to visit. and of course saw me with a falcon. As a young boy, I was a young schoolboy. If I remember offhand, I was probably about 14 or 15 at that stage, and the gentleman's name was Colonel Frik van Oudtshoorn. And Colonel van Oudtshoorn said, when you're old enough and you get your call-up papers, send them through to me, because we need people like you. The Air Force has a little falconry division to keep birds off the runway. And that's what I did for my 2 years national service. And since then, I've been fighting tooth and nail to legalize falconry in South Africa. As I said, I had a hand in the Cape Falconers Club, myself and Edmund Oertel. We had a hand together with the late Ron Hartley in the forming of SAFA, the South African Falconry Association. So yeah, I've tried to do things by the straight and narrow, as it were.
Well, and I mean, just to clarify, though, I mean, was it that it was expressly illegal, or that it was just that there really wasn't any regulations?
No, it was expressly illegal, to such an extent. And this is why I say, I did mention earlier on, my dad was a bit of a stickler for abiding by the law. And if I recall, it was probably around about, I probably would have been in standard 8, which I think in your terms would be grade 10, 15, 16-year-old kid. I came home and my dad actually called me into his office, and he had the local newspaper, the Herald. The middle spread of the newspaper was falconry and illegal falconry, and the consequences of illegal falconry. And in those days, when we're talking many years ago, the fine was 2,000 Rand. Bearing in mind, in those days, at one stage, the Rand was actually, believe it or not, stronger than the US dollar. So they were hefty fines. As I say, it was 2,000 Rand. You also ran the risk that your car might be confiscated. And of course, I was a kid, so I relied on my parents and their vehicles. It was either at one stage on a bicycle with a hawk, on foot with a hawk, at a later stage with a motorbike with a hawk, or mom or dad's taxi. That's how I got around. And as I say, my father, showed me this article and said, well, what I'm doing is illegal and it's got to stop. And I told him it's not going to stop. He was quite upset with me. But the ramification of that was that I was not allowed to use his car. He said, your hawks will never go into my car again. I'm pleased to say that he traveled a lot. So between my mom and I, when he was away, the two of us took advantage of his car. But yeah, no, there were hefty fines. The main reason why I did falconry illegally, I do believe we should all abide by the law. But in those days, as I said, we had a lot of family and family friends that were farmers. And in those days, falconry was illegal, but you could shoot birds of prey fairly, I'm just trying to think of the right word.
Indiscriminately?
Indiscriminately, yeah. The law, if I remember correctly, the law said something to the effect of, if you had a problem animal, in effect what you had to do was concentrate the local nature conservation, your equivalent of fish and wildlife officer, notify him that you have a problem animal, and then he or she would come over and have a look-see, and then decide whether the animal was a problem or not. Long and short of it was, if they felt it was a problem and shooting the animal was the right sort of recourse, then so be it. But where the loophole was that if you, and I'm going to put this in inverted commas, if you couldn't get hold of your local wildlife official, you could then shoot the animal as long as you notified them. If I remember offhand, it was within 14 days. So yes, there were a lot of black eagles that probably ended up buried or just left out in the veld. And I know black eagles specifically because of our friends. I mean, I was presented with quite a few talons from black eagles specifically that were, in those days they were called lammervangers, lamb catchers. And with most farmers, the only good eagle was a dead eagle. Obviously, the same applied to chickens. You know, if you had a black sparrow hawk or whatever that was killing your chickens, go ahead and shoot it. So yes, there were. You know, it wasn't just a figment of one's imagination. There was severe fines.
Yeah, so it sounds kind of like, something similar, except not even necessarily with the monetary reward that was. It's kind of similar to kind of like the bounties that they used to have, back in the U.S.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we used to have those bounties both on birds of prey and then also on jackal and what else? Guys would hang up their tails and that sort of nonsense. Or you took, I think the other one was the ground squirrel. If I remember correctly, you could take tails through to your local conservation office and they would then reward you, if you ran for every tail or whatever the case was. Possibly a few cents. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, and, out of curiosity too, then, do you know why, or was there a particular reason why at the time it was expressly illegal? I mean, was it just a law that was in place that had just been in place and...
I think it was just a law that was in place. I think it started off, I'm specifically talking about what in those days was the Cape Province.
Sure.
Funny enough, and obviously I didn't know that at that stage, but in KZN, what is KZN now, which in those days was Natal, falconry was legal. And then also in what we refer to as the Old Transvaal, falconry was also legal. I beg your pardon, was legal. So both in Natal and Transvaal, falconry was legal. The Cape, it was illegal, and in the Free State, I think the Free State was pretty much, no one really cared. But in the Cape, for whatever reason, it was specifically illegal. I'm not sure why they did it. I think it was, if you look at the old South African falconry history, you've got Jaime van what was Jaime's surname now? I've drawn a blank. Sorry, I just can't remember his surname. But he used to fly a lot of red-breast sparrowhawks, lanner falcons, etc. in the Cape in the just after the Second World War, early 50s, and that sort of era. There wasn't an issue with it. But somewhere between there and probably 1970 odd, it specifically became illegal. As I say, to such an extent that they would confiscate your car. That is pretty much, I suppose, the same as poaching. I know that also applied to poaching at one stage. If you were caught poaching, one of the besides confiscating your rifle, they could also confiscate the vehicle.
Yeah. So and you'd said it wasn't illegal in the other provinces, but just around.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing was once I got into the Air Force, which was in 1983, I ended up in Pretoria in the Air Force, and shortly after arriving in the Transvaal, we were called in by the director of nature conservation, Dr. Pitt Mulder, called all falcons in for a meeting. And I don't think there were many of us. If I remember offhand, probably no more than 30 falconers, give or take. And he called us into a meeting at his office, and there and then announced that his department, they don't really have the resources or the inclination to police falconry. And personally, he doesn't really like falconry, so he's just decided that falconry is illegal. So falconry in the Transvaal, in the then Transvaal, was illegal, made illegal from 1983 until, if I recall offhand, 86, I think 86, 87. So a stint of 3 to 4 years, it was illegal. It was an interesting time. Obviously, being Air Force falconers, we were exempt. We being myself and my colleague Mark. There were two of us that flew birds on the runways. Obviously, from an Air Force point of view, it was quite interesting. It wasn't a case of you go to do national service and they hand you a book and learn how to do falconry. Hence why Colonel van Oudtshoorn brought me in. They needed falconers that actually knew about falconry, had the ability, etc. My colleague Mark Yennis, he was a graded he wasn't graded. We didn't have grading in those days. We had He had to write some or other exam, and he'd passed his exam. If I recall, he hadn't actually picked up a hawk at that stage, but Mark was brought in from the medics. He was sent up, he went to the medics, did his initial basic training in the medics, and then they brought him into the Air Force as a falconer. The two falconers that we took over from, Len Foster was a chef in infantry, and Mark Labuskachny, a Transvaal falconer, still a very active falconer. Mark was one of the few that actually went directly into the Air Force. Otherwise, they kind of grabbed us from everywhere. But as I say, we were exempt because we were Air Force falconers. But after our 2-year stint, we were fair game. And unfortunately, that's literally what we became. I mean, you speak to some of the older boys and they'll tell you about being chased all over the countryside, hiding hawks under beds, leaving hawks at neighbors' houses, etc. It wasn't a good time.
It doesn't sound like it.
No, it wasn't. It was unpleasant.
Well, so, I mean, was it pretty much right after you got out and, that this... the unpleasantness was kind of going on? I mean, was that around the time that you were kind of inspired to try and form some kind of, organization to kind of combat the, try and get it legal? Or, I mean, what was your kind of inspiration for that?
John, to be honest, straight after the Air Force, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be a cattle farmer or whether I wanted to be a game rancher. And it was a case of going off to college, etc., and doing an agricultural degree. And I then decided to actually spend some time with a friend of ours who did both in the Cape. So I came back into the Cape, back into an illegal environment, and carried on with my falconry illegally. And I had a burning passion as a child to get up to what was then Rhodesia, and of course, by the time I was old enough to drive, they'd changed the flag and it had become Zimbabwe. Anyway, I'd heard about the Zimbabwean falconers, and I then decided to pack up my Katunda together with my English pointel, Kelly, and the two of us headed up north and arrived on the doorstep of the late Ron Hartley. Introduced myself and ended up in Zimbabwe for many years. And that's really where I got an understanding for legalized falconry, the systems that they were using, etc. And in time brought those systems back to South Africa from the grading. The grading system that the Zimbabweans were using, their particular method of tethering birds was something else that we brought back with us. And in time, once unfortunately I couldn't, I lived in Zimbabwe illegally, being a white man in a newly independent Zimbabwe. They weren't too keen to take in South Africans. So we tried, between myself and some of my friends in Zimbabwe, we tried to organize work permits, etc., and it just didn't happen. We tried the pest control angle, using falcons for quelea control. And I lived in Zimbabwe illegally for quite a few years, and then eventually decided, look, it's just not going anywhere. It's time to get back to reality and actually start earning an income and do things properly. And that's where I brought a lot of the Zimbabwean ideas came back with me. I then subsequently introduced quite a few South African falconers to my Zimbabwean friends, and myself and a few others got together with the late Ron Hartley, and conceptualized the South African Falconry Association. We looked at your association, NAFA, and for various reasons, it wasn't quite the right model for us. Essentially, NAFA is an individual, an organization for individuals, whereas SAF is an organization for clubs, associations. So we sort of looked at a mix between NAFA and the UK Hawk Board. Put what we could together and brought it back to South Africa. And that was quite a few years ago, in 1990. We introduced the SAFA model to South African falconry. And it's been a very good model. It's worked very well for us. Looking at mentorship, looking at grading, just more of a sort of structured form of falconry. And why we went that route was going back to what old Pitt Mulder had said. I don't have the resources, both time and money and staff. And we then went back to them with the model of self-policing. Self-administration, self-policing, call it what you wish. And that's pretty much what we do in South Africa. Mentor our falconers. We have the grading system. It's a fairly rigorous system, but it works. It works very well for us. And of course, what happened during that very brief period where falconry was illegal in the Transvaal, there were some horrendous things that happened. Youngsters were keen on falconry, but they just didn't know where to turn. They didn't quite know what to do with themselves. I remember one. I hope you're going to interview my good friend Edmund Oertel. Edmund was actually our vet at that stage, and one of the youngsters ended up with a kestrel that he'd mistreated, and gangrene had set in, and he was petrified to take the bird to Edmund. So as the Air Force Falconers, myself and Mark took the bird to Edmund quickly to have a look at, and I think the youngster was lucky to get away with the bollocking. I think he could have got more from Edmund. There was an incident where some youngsters went to remove black sparrowhawks, and they didn't quite know what they were doing. So, cut a long story short, they got Dad's chainsaw and duly sawed the tree down, and in the process ended up killing. I think, if I remember, there were 3 or 4 ibises in that nest. They ended up killing at least 2 of them. So, yeah, things weren't pleasant. And this is what we went back to conservation with. And we said, look, we're not going to go away. We're not going to go away. Let us start policing ourselves and administrating ourselves. And I'm pleased to say that they subscribe to that model. And this is where we are today. One of the reasons behind SAFA was it was basically watching the winds of change as it swept across Africa. And Ron actually highlighted it to us, Ron Hartley highlighted it to us, that we're going to sit in a position where in those days South Africa had 4 provinces. We had the Cape, Natal, Transvaal, and the Free State, Orange Free State. And he said, as soon as you have the political change, which is coming, you're going to end up with more provinces. And we did. I mean, we went from 4 to 9. And of course, each province is almost autonomous in their own sort of legislation as far as conservation matters are concerned. And this is why we needed to standardize things. And that's pretty much the motivation behind SAFA.
Okay. And yeah, I know, like I've kind of talked about this briefly with, Andre and some of the others about, just kind of the subtle differences in models. Because I mean, you mentioned, you looked at NAFA and you decided that it really wasn't, kind of ideal, or it just wasn't quite right, and everything else. But I know that's one of the differences in the way you guys do things as opposed to the way that we do things that I thought was really interesting was that, like clubs for us, I mean, they definitely serve a purpose. Yes. and they're good representation for us as a whole and stuff, but individually, as you kind of alluded to, we still do things individually, very much, so I mean, we can as individuals be members of NAFA and our state club and even other state clubs and things like that, but why in particular did you all feel then that kind of model of kind of being more of a club representation was better for you all here in South Africa versus, have a more individualistic approach?
I think, John, the short answer is the conservation authorities. The conservation authorities weren't open to dealing with a lot of individuals knocking on their door. And I think it would have, the headache of having to deal with individuals was really part and parcel why they weren't interested in falconry. Whereas, coming to them as a club, a lot of clubs, even today, they still, a part of their constitution, highlights the fact that only certain people in that club can actually go and communicate with the conservation authorities. It's usually the committee, the chairman and the secretary usually are the ones that negotiate our quota with conservation, give them the annual report, etc. So they don't have to be dealing with 40 or 50 different individuals. They're dealing with 2 or 3 individuals. They get an idea of what we're doing, and those 2 or 3 individuals through the club keep things going. Something that's been quite interesting in our own sort of development, and a lot of our younger falconers didn't quite understand it. I think if you look at a lot of falconry clubs worldwide, a falconry club is very much a social sort of club. I'm specifically referring to the UK. You know, you'd have a group of friends from a particular area, and they decide to form a falconry club, and they meet in the pub and they do whatever they do. It's a very much of a social type club. Whereas with us, falconry clubs are not social. Obviously, as we hopefully going to have this weekend, I mean, it is a social get together, etc. But the essence behind that club is actually an administrative function, not a social function, and that's pretty much what we do.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, thanks for making that distinction, because I mean, like I said, I know people are going to probably hear quite a bit, you know, once they listen to this series, about some of these different political aspects of falconry here. But, you know, I want to, especially from someone like yourself who was kind of involved in the early days of it all, you know, it's nice to get clarification straight from, you know, kind of the source on that, you know. So yeah, but so it was shortly after that then that you guys decided to form the Cape Falconry Club too. Then
literally at the same time. Literally at the same time. There's a lot of, as we often have with clubs and falconry, there is a bit of politicking obviously behind the scenes, and Edmund and I realized that we weren't, with a lot of falconers, we weren't exactly the flavor of the month, and there was a bit of opposition to the falconry, to the SAFA model, and I think the main opposition, well, at that stage, we felt the main opposition was not the principle behind SAFA, but rather the characters behind SAFA. Now, as I say, SAFA was conceptualized by the late Ron Hartley, myself, Dr. Edmund Oertel, Dr. Benny van der Merwe, Dr. Dieter Necht, to a certain extent, Rob Booth as well. But there was a bit of ill feeling between myself, Edmund, and some other falconers, and we realized that it wasn't going to fly as long as Edmund and I were involved, and we actually withdrew. We put what we could on the table. We handed the reins over to Benny and Dieter, very much so. Ron obviously wasn't that involved with the actual implementing of things because he was still up in Zimbabwe. And Edmund and I, maybe we were just bored. We had too much time on our hands. Edmund had recently moved down to the Cape. He'd recently moved down to the Cape from the Transvaal, from Pretoria, and he needed to get falconry legalized. Edmund started working on the conservation authorities, and I then came in and helped him, and we managed to get falconry legalized in the Cape, which was unheard. I mean, everyone thought it was going to be impossible. Not only did we get falconry legalized, we were actually, in those days, of all the clubs. Now there were 4 clubs, as I say, with the 4 provinces. So we had the Free State had just started up just after I left the Air Force. It was started by a young student by the name of Sean Ranger, together with my cousin, old Pierre Craven. The 2 of them started the Free State Club with a bit of help, from me. That was in the early 1980s, just after my national service. Then we had the Transvaal Club, which we then got going again through a gentleman by the name of Tim Wagner in I think it was 86 or 87, if I remember correctly, which also included a wild take of peregrine falcons. The conservation authorities allowed us to take peregrines, which was a first. And then, of course, the Natal Club. The Natal Club had been going for years, so there was no issue there. So the Cape Club was the last of the falconry clubs to be formed, and but we were the first club to have what we called an open season. We basically haven't had an open hunting season. It came about myself, and just after Cape Nature had legalized falconry in the Cape, Edmund and I took the then director of, I think he was director of biodiversity, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Cas Hamman. We took him out hawking with us. We had 3 peregrines. I had a Scottish female and a Scottish tersel, and Edmund had a little. I think it was a Brookii tersel that we'd imported. In fact, the tersel that he had, he'd bred. Edmund was the first falconer in South Africa to breed peregrine falcons. He brought in, he and Benny brought in 2 pairs of what was supposedly peregrinus, but a lot of people thought they were probably Brookii. And the birds bred. Edmund bred a bird by the name of Helen, who he was flying in the Cape in those days, even though things, as I say, were illegal. Anyway, we took old Cas Hamman out with us. The 2 tersels saw some grey wing, but they didn't put anything in the bag. But they didn't embarrass us. They flew very well. And my falcon Storm went and caught a hybrid. Problem that we have in the Western Cape in particular is the local yellow-billed duck hybridizes with the mallard, and Storm went and hooked a hybrid, and old Cuss was doing flick-flacks. He was so excited about this hybrid. And anyway, I saw an opportunity and I grabbed it. And while he was doing his flick-flacks, I said, look, how do you feel about us having an open hunting season? And based on that, it was a case of motivate it, put it in writing, and I will sign it. And they then gave the Cape Falconers what they called a let lie policy, where you could basically go out 365 days a year. Obviously, don't try and hunt things that are breeding. Try not to hunt endangered or rare birds, obviously. But yeah, whatever your hawk caught, you're allowed to feed the hawk up on it, and then leave the rest of the carcass in the vault for the jackal and the whatever else wants to come, and mongoose or whatever. So that, as I said, that was a first, which then of course went across the country.
Well, and like I said, I can only imagine how much work all that was for you. But I mean, that's a great overview though for kind of just a general history of how everything kind of evolved, with this country. And like I said, I find all this stuff fascinating personally, and I think that the more that people around the world understand what other countries kind of have had to go through, the more that they'll either, they'll appreciate or strive to,
Absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah.
it understanding, kind of breeds, some empathy, I think,
Yes, I think so too.
But it's going back to some of your personal, stuff. And so how did you find yourself then in and you said it was Dubai?
In Dubai.
Yeah.
In the Middle East.
How'd you find yourself, doing abatement there then?
For my sins. Well, I mean, my falconry is flying peregrine after duck and grey-winged francolin. That's what flicks my switch. I've done some funny things which really come from my days in Zimbabwe. Catching green pigeons. I mean, green pigeons are just phenomenal birds. Now, in South Africa, it was something that we never really looked at. Came back from Zim and I was catching green pigeons with what we call them lanner tersels. I know the rest of the world calls them lannerets. I find it sounds like some sort of horrible contagious disease. But yeah, I was flying a lanner tersel and he did very well. Amongst others, he put green pigeons in the bag, and he was, as far as we know, he was the first bird to put sandgrass in the bag. So yeah, that's my sort of focus. But I've mentored a lot of falconers. I also, for my sins, started the first bird of prey center of its kind in Africa, and doing that, I had obviously had a lot of interested people approaching me, and one of those interested people was a young boy from an area in the northern part of our country called, well, in those days it was called Petersburg. It's now called Polokwane. I opened up a bird park in the town. And this youngster came up to me and he wanted to learn about falconry. So we took old Rowan under our wing. And a few years later, he was in a position where he was employed, funny enough, by an ex-South African who'd never practiced falconry in South Africa, but was introduced to falconry in the UAE. And Rowan ended up working for him, doing pest control, etc. And eventually he decided to go out on his own. And I guess when you're in a bit of a spot like that, you go back to your old mentor. So he knocked on my door and employed me as a consultant to help him with his business. And that's how I first ended up in the UAE. Took my son James with me. James and Rowan worked together for a few years, and eventually James went off on his own and again called on his dad. You know, James is just over 30 now, and he's grown up with hawks his entire life. But obviously from a pest control point of view, I mean, there's sort of pest control is not falconry by any stretch of the imagination. I think we all know that. I mean, but he needed a couple of tips as well. So that's pretty much what I did how I ended up in Dubai, which, to be honest, is one of the most frustrating. It's one of the most, from a falconry point of view, it's one of the most frustrating things that you'll ever go through, because you have such a selection of hawks. You know, one just goes down to the souk and they're just things that a lot of us just dream about. I mean, I looked at a red-naped Shaheen sitting in the souk and I was just desperate to buy her, because it is one of, you know, after reading old Bruce Hark's, what's Bruce Hark's book called again?
Oh, he's got several.
He's got several, yeah, not Plains of the Prairie.
There's the Hunting Falcon.
The Hunting Falcon, that's the one. And I mean, after reading that book, I mean, I think there are a lot of us that would give our eye teeth to fly red-naped Shaheens. And as I say, I'm sitting at the souk looking at this most gorgeous passage red-naped Shaheen, and I was about to dig into my pocket and buy her, and then I realized, but what do I hunt at? You know, there's just nothing to hunt in the UAE. In fact, hunting is illegal. Obviously, from a pest control point of view, we get special dispensation, etc., to chase crows around and pigeons. But, you know, you're sitting with something that, with 30, 40 duck on a pond, I would love to have, you know, up there with the angels above me. And you just can't. I mean, you know, and I've looked at a lot of these birds, and it's such a crying shame. You know, one plays with them, but you don't do falconry with them. Obviously, ideally, one would like to export them to your home country, but all in time, I guess.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. Well, this would also be a good time now then to kind of transition into, you know, getting one of those memorable, you know, I know someone that's been involved in all this for as long as you have. I mean, there's tons of stories and we could go on all day, but what's like that one story or like memory that you have, you know, as far as like a hunting experience, a particular bird that you had, or, you know, it seems like there's always at least one or two memorable things.
Absolutely.
You know, so I mean, what's yours?
John, to be honest, I mean, there's so many of them. I can sit back and think of my first sandgrass that I caught, because in those days, I mean, it was unheard of. In fact, part and parcel of my trip to Zimbabwe was to see what the guys were doing, and they'd been trying for years. That, you know, a lot of them used to go up to the Makgati pans in Botswana to try and hunt sandgrass, and none of them were able to put sandgrass in the bag. One of the reasons I took a job in the Kalahari Desert was to go and hunt sandgrass. So yeah, that could be one of those moments. Putting 2 sandgrass in the bag in one flight. I mean, that's another one that comes to mind. But I think for me, probably one of the most memorable is flights, and it's maybe because we're sitting in the Western Cape at the moment, it was just down the road from here, is I lived in the Western Cape, obviously, when Edmund and I were busy legalizing falconry in the Cape, and it was a Sunday afternoon. Edmund had a very well-known conservationist visiting with them, a guy by the name of Dave Pepler. Now, Dave Pepler is one of those people that he just has a knack of finding peregrine iris. I mean, he's just phenomenal. He helped us out a lot many years ago when we got permission to take peregrines, etc. But it was a Sunday afternoon, and David arrived at Edmund's place. They were having what we term a braai, you guys call a barbecue. They were having a barbecue, and I stopped off at the house and said, look, I'm going out to fly Storm, my Scottish female. And I know she's Scottish because she came from a lovely gentleman by the name of Ray Turner from Game Hawk fame. Ray's birds, he can take you back to the particular eyrie where the genetics came from. So yes, I had my Scottish female Storm with me, 970 grams. And I stopped at Edmund's place and said, guys, I'm going. Are you going to join me? And it was a case of, no, we're still busy, etc. We might go out later, etc. Anyway, I went out to a big dam out in the wheatlands, and literally crawled up the dam wall. These particular dams in the wheatland, they have a what we call a shell duck. It's one of our bigger duck. In fact, all the shell duck that I caught were probably give or take over 1.8 kilograms. Nice big duck, strong duck, wild duck. Probably my favorite duck. The yellowbill is quite a tame duck. In fact, with Storm being at 970 odd grams hunting weight, the yellowbill duck, one almost sort of got the feeling that she should have one in either hand. And anyway, my passion was shell duck, and I arrived at this particularly large dam, crept up the dam wall, sort of looked through the bulrushes, reeds, whatever you want to call them, and there was one lone shell duck on the far side of the dam. Normally, you would have just turned around and gone home, but the shell duck, because of their wildness, wasn't an issue. I cast young Storm off, and she was one of those that used to perch on the moon. The higher, the better, and she went off and did her thing, and my wife and I stood and watched at the bottom of the dam wall, stood and watched her, and off she went. Eventually, she was a little speck in the sky, and I crept up the wall again, and as I stood up, that shell duck just took one look at me, and off it went. And I was watching Storm. The shell duck went, and it was flying, and Storm was quite way out as well, and she came steaming across the sky and then put in that stoop. And I was just watching this never-ending stoop. I mean, she was just coming and coming and coming. By then, I had no idea where the duck was, how high the duck was, and next minute, Storm hit this shell duck. She struck the thing, and the shell duck literally just came tumbling out of the sky, and I was watching the duck tumbling out of the sky and blow me down as we got closer to the ground, because at this stage I would hazard a guess the duck must have been a good 40, 50 foot up already, meters up already. And by the time it got to the deck and it came in my vision, there was Edmund and Dave Pepler. And literally, I think one of them still had to duck, and the shell duck hit the deck, and it was one of those moments when it was literally, it just didn't stop tumbling. It sort of bounced and just tumbled and rolled. And of course, old Storm was just winnowing down, and down she came, but literally at their feet. That, to me, especially in where we're sitting today, is a memory that it brings a smile to my face.
Sounds like a hell of a flight.
It was an awesome flight. Oh, no, she was a good girl that day. Wow.
Yeah, well, and yeah, those are always the memories that make it all worthwhile for all the other stuff that we have to go through and deal with. And yeah, I mean, like I said, it sounds like you've had, a pretty incredible history with all this stuff, and for all of the things that, you kind of had to go through, and I hope it, it seems like it's all been worth it for you, I mean,
absolutely, it has.
Yeah, no,
I've been rewarded tenfold, which is wonderful. I mean, if I look at in fact, this particular meeting is going to be really interesting. Obviously, I got into breeding as well. And something that I was playing with, and which is paying dividends is we start looking at designer peregrines. Now, I know the Americans came up with the designer peregrine. It was kind of frowned upon in our neck of the woods. But I started playing with designer peregrines. Now, from what I understand, this particular meet of the 14 long wings that will be flown, 10 of them come out of my breeding line. So that's something quite... I think that's quite an achievement, and it gives you a nice, warm, cozy, cuddly feeling to know that, you know, your genetics are out there. The birds are doing well. I mean, we're talking about birds that are really, really performing. So I'm looking forward to seeing those 10 birds go.
Well, assuming that we get a clear flipping day sometime this week.
Looks like the rain has stopped, eh?
Yeah. Well, and just, I mean, before we kind of wrap up, I mean, talk briefly then, if you've had an established breeding project for a while and you've had these lines come out, I mean, how did you get into that then?
It was just one of those things that we had to do, I guess. It's an interesting question, John, from the point of view that initially, as I say, you know, I'm battling to remember when falconry was banned in 1983 in the Transvaal. I seem to remember it was 1986. It could have been 87 that it was legalized. But one of the conditions of that was that we had to go out, get our own peregrines. They gave us, I can't remember offhand, it was 2 peregrines per year for the next 5 years, if I remember correctly, that we were allowed to go and harvest. And thereafter, we had to be self-sufficient. So we were literally forced into the breeding side of things. The truth of it is we then got to a stage where there were quite a few of us breeding, and it kind of fell away. I mean, we're not forced to breed. In fact, interestingly enough, the Western Capes specifically don't actually want captive breeding, mainly because their local ornithologist, possibly rightly so, just doesn't feel comfortable with birds sitting in a breeding pen. He said, you know, if you look at the numbers of peregrines that we have around, there's absolutely no justification that we can't harvest these birds sustainably. And as Andrew says, for them to sit in breeding pens, just, you know, wilting away year after year, he said it doesn't do his psyche or his heart any good. So go ahead and catch passage birds. From my point of view, I enjoyed the breeding. I've actually, obviously, when I moved up to Dubai, I needed to pass my birds on. So that whole line has gone to a friend of mine. We've started there are 3 of us that started a breeding cooperative. So Gert at the moment is sitting with all the birds. But it was interesting. You know, I've flown the Peregrinus peregrinus, your Scottish. I've flown the African peregrine. Peregrine, the minor, Falca peregrinus minor, has a very heavy wing loading. It's quite an incredible bird to watch when they take off the fist. I mean, they literally hit the deck. You know, the bird starts flapping and it just drops. And just before she hits the ground, off she goes. So incredibly heavy wing loading. Then you go to your peregrinus, not as much. I then flew an anatum, which someone brought in. They brought in a natum. A few natums came in from the States. This particular tersel came in from Canada. But I trapped a passage calidus, which migrate to southern Africa, all the way from the steppes of Russia, and all of a sudden I was sitting with a totally different animal. I mean, your calidus has an incredibly light wing loading, and it literally looked like a lanner the way it flew. Incredibly buoyant and straight off the fist, and literally mounted 15, 20 foot before, you know, within the first 2 or 3 wing beats. Looking at that, I then played with the idea of putting putting the African into the Calidus into the African, which would obviously give us a slightly bigger bird, which we needed. The African female can be a bit small for duck. Some of them are intimidated, even with the yellowbill. Yellowbill, I don't do much weighing these days, but I used to weigh a lot of what I caught. I would weigh, and if I remember offhand, the heaviest yellowbill that I ever put in the bag, if I remember correctly, was 1,400 and something grams. Your average is around about 1,100. And a lot of the Africans were a bit intimidated by the size of the yellowbill. So it was nice just to put a bit of extra spice in there. Got a slightly bigger bird, and this is how we got into the designer peregrines, line breeding of designer peregrines. All the hawks that we use are obviously seasoned. What's the word I'm looking for? Not just seasoned hawks, but they'd achieved what we set out to do. And as I say, we're actually producing some incredible birds. What they're doing currently, the speed that they come, and we actually call them turbos. Locally, we refer to them as turbo peregrines. They have the buoyancy that you get in some of your hybrids. As I say, from your Lana, you've got this incredibly buoyant sort of floppy type of bird that all of a sudden just drops a gear or two, hits the turbo, and just goes. I mean, in fact, I sent some to the UAE, to Dubai, and the Arabs were just blown over. Obviously, they were small birds, which, small compared to some of the northern races that the Arabs are used to. If I remember offhand, the birds that we sent to the UAE was sort of just touching on 800 grams. So they were still quite small for the Arabs, but they couldn't get over the speed. I mean, these birds were catching pigeons off the fist. And a lot of the Arabs actually commented about, wow, where do these hawks get their speed? They have unbelievable speed. Whether we'll ever pick up those speeds on GPS transmitters, I don't know. But we're getting some phenomenal speeds. And the birds, they'll see a pigeon in the distance and they literally just row it in, which can be a problem if not in the right hands.
Yeah, that can always prove to be it can be a conundrum every so often, to put it lightly. But, I mean, like I said, I know we could talk the rest of the day about this stuff probably, but, it sounds like we've done at least a little bit of a decent job in kind of encompassing, most of your history in this area, or at least a decent amount of it anyway. But I do want to end with, on the same note that I have been ending for a while now on a lot of these episodes. And I want to get at least, the best piece of advice or the best sentiment that you can leave, current or even prospective falconers.
From my perspective, and it's been my philosophy throughout this, get yourself a good mentor. I think, falconry books are wonderful. You'll learn. I taught myself falconry. It's essentially, I mean, as I say, as a youngster, left Europe and I ended up in Port Elizabeth without a falconer within thousands of kilometers. There just weren't falconers around. So I had to teach myself. So yes, my advice to any aspiring falconer is find yourself a mentor. Get out there, find a mentor, find the right mentor. It's incredibly, you have to have the right mentor. I'm not going to go into too much depth on that one, but find someone that's out there doing it, who's burning the diesel and getting out there with the hawks.
Well, not only that too, but it's a good personality fit for you as well. That's going to tolerate.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely,
and because let's just face it. I mean, some of the people that are best at what they do, they aren't always the best teachers.
This is very true,
and especially the best teachers for us, individually sometimes too. Yeah. So, well, I mean, like I said, I think that's a great note to end on then. And like I said, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And like I said, it's been great being able to make this work. And I appreciate everyone kind of hosting me out here. And like I said, I'm hoping that at some point I mean, whoa, is that the sun?
That's the sun.
Is that the sun over there? Oh, I'll be damned. Well, I mean,
I think it's time to get out and fly some hawks.
Yeah, it might actually happen. I don't know, but anyway, like I said, cheers again, and I really appreciate your time, Trevor, and thanks for being so also transparent.
Thank you, John.
I mean, I don't know if everybody would be so open, with some of the trials and tribulations and some of the things that they, did in their younger days, and when things weren't always so kosher, so to speak. But I do think it puts things into a good perspective for people, just what, some other people have had to go through, just to make falconry work.
Absolutely, John. I couldn't agree with you more. I look at other countries and I some days think that people don't actually appreciate what they have. I'm not going to name countries, but I have looked at some countries, and guys, just get your act together, do things right, do it properly, because you can lose it. I mean, we lost it. We literally lost it overnight. I'm going back obviously to 1983 when old Dr. Pitt Mulder said, boys and girls, that's it. I don't have the resources. I don't have the time. I don't have the manpower. And you know what? I actually don't like falconry. And yeah, it can always be taken away. Yeah. So fight for what you have and enjoy what you have. And thank you so much for your time and for coming all the way down south.
Yeah, no, like I said, I enjoy seeing the world, and I'm really glad that things have worked out. I'm really glad things have worked out to where I can not only see some of the world, but also see falconry in so many different places and meet, a lot of incredible people.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
So
it's amazing. We all come from different nations, different cultures, but there's that passion that really binds us, and it binds us incredibly well. I don't think people actually realize that, especially, in my case, dealing with some of the Emiratis. I mean, we might not speak the same language, but I tell you what, when we start talking hawks, we're all on the same page, whether it's just through hand motions, etc. But we understand each other, and there's that camaraderie ship and that brotherhood, and dare I say, sisterhood as well. There are a lot of good girls out there flying hawks, and we all share a passion, and I think I think a lot of people see that passion, and they're probably surprised by how that passion has bound us.
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, couldn't agree more. And like I said, I'm appreciative of the opportunities that this whole endeavor has kind of brought. And I mean, like I said, hopefully we'll get to see some damn birds fly soon, man.
Well, I know that they're 10 of my breeding out there that I'd love to see the next few days. So yes.
All right. Well,
thank you, John.
Thank you, and hopefully we have some fun the rest of the week.
Excellent.
Here.
Thank you so much. Be
All right.
good.
Thanks,
Take
Trevor.
care.